Hello, everyone, and on behalf of the Crime Writers Association, welcome to Steve Cavanagh and Friends Pick Up a Page Turner for National Crime Reading Month, once again in partnership with the Reading Agency. I'm Anthony Johnston. I'm a former vice chair of the CWA and author of the Dog Sitter Detective Mysteries, but I am not taking part in tonight's event. I am not a panelist. Instead, I'm here to do all the technical stuff behind the scenes and to remind you all out there that this is just one of the many events taking place across the UK and Ireland this month as part of National Crime Reading Month. You can find more events online and near you at crimereading.com. And if you happen to be an event organizer, that is also the same place that you can go and tell us about your event so we can help promote it. National Crime Reading Month culminates in the CWA Daggers. The awards ceremony is in London on July 4th. Yes, election day, I know. Thanks for that, Rishi. Tickets for the Daggers are still on sale, but there are very few left. So if you want to snatch one up, go to our website at thecwa.co.uk and get your ticket today. All right, that is enough from me. I'm going to be back at the end, but for now, I will pass you over to a man who has a CWA dagger on his shelf and is also one of our ambassadors for National Crime Reading Month, Steve Cavanagh. Steve, over to you.
Anthony, thank you so much. I should also mention, while our other panelists come in, I think we can let them all in now, and so they can see themselves. And I will just want to mention that, as well as Anthony doing all the facilitating all of this for us, he is a fabulous author, and you should check out his books. He is the author of the Dog Sitter Detective series. He also, his graphic novel was adapted into the movie Atomic Blonde, starring Charlize Theron. He's also written for Marvel, Daredevil, Wolverine, and he's written for video games. He's written Resident Evil Village, Dead Space, and more. So thanks very much, Anthony. Hello, folks. I can see people coming in now. That's great. It's nice to see there are panelists here. I'm not here on my own. Hello. So I'm going to introduce our fabulous panel. Thank you all for being here. So first we have I.S. Berry, Ilana Berry.
Hello.
Hi, Ilana. But Ilana is maybe new to some of the UK crime readers. Her debut novel comes out later this year. But her book it's been published in America for a little while now and has already garnered multiple awards. It's this book, The Peacock and the Sparrow, which I picked up from Atria Books. It's already won an Edgar Award and another award. And as well as that, Ilana used to be in the CIA. She was an operations officer for the CIA, so she could kill people with plastic cutlery. And everything else. So hello, Ilana. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here. I only have one book to my name, but I'm honored to be here.
No, you're delighted you are here. Delighted you are here. Our next panelist is Stuart Neville. Now, Stuart Neville didn't used to be in the CIA. He's never been in the CIA. But he does have a
never been a member of any three-letter organization.
No, nor any organizations. But he does have an impressive collection of AC/DC T-shirts, which is maybe just as cool. And he also has the odd guitar, as you can see there. Mr. Neville is the author of the 12 published in the US as The Ghosts of Belfast. He's the author of the Jack Lennon novels, the Serena Flanagan books, standalone novels, and his new book, Blood Like Mine, comes out later this year. He's also lead guitarist for a little-known band called the Fun-Loving Crime Writers, who will be playing Glastonbury Festival this year. Hello, Mr. Neville. Thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome. I'm going to explain at the offset. I'm honestly not copying Sean's trademark look here.
I was going to say.
I've got a nickel allergy, which isn't great for a guitar player for a start, but it's caused me a horrendous, ugly rash on my forehead, which I'm not going to inflict on the rest of you, thus a hat.
You're wearing a hat. I take it you don't wear that hat outside because you live in a very rural part of Northern Ireland. You might get murdered if you wear a hat like that.
The hats, scarves, anything decorative doesn't go down well here.
No, people don't like it. You can get burned.
Oh, aye.
So that's great. As long as you're in the house with that, that's great. Next, we have S.A. Cosby, Sean Cosby, who is the author of Blacktop Wasteland His latest book is All the Sinners Bleed. He's a multiple award winner and superstar. And I think, in fairness, Sean has the better hat this evening. No offense, Mr. Neville.
Yeah.
But hello, Sean. How are you? Thanks for joining us.
Hey, guys. Thank you for having me. And yes, my hat collection has improved as my book sales has went up. So I've gotten better hats. Have
you got a big black hat yet? Do you need one of those big black fedora things? Have you got one of those?
I have one of those, and I wore it to the Edgars, and I've worn it to the Edgars twice. I've been nominated twice, and I lost. So if I ever get nominated again, I'm wearing this. And while I have you, just so everybody knows, Steve is one of the great crime writers working today. He's also the worst person to drink with, because I drank with Steve at Harrogate last year, Steve and Craig Sisterson, and I remember 3 days out of the 4 I was there. So that just give you an idea what it's like to drink whiskey with Steve Cavanagh in a pub in Harrogate. So,
thank you very much. That's a great honor. I should get a plaque made of that, wearing it around my neck. Great, like an emergency medical card. Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here, folks. As Dudley mentioned, it's National Crime Reading Month, so we're going to talk about your books and writing, of course, but we're also going to talk about reading. So I thought, Alana, you're possibly the most fascinating person I've ever spoken to.
Thank you.
So I want to ask about you and your background and your relationship with reading. Where did you get started reading?
Yeah, I was a spy. I didn't really read a lot of spy novels, especially not when I was in the CIA, because a lot of them are kind of unrealistic. So I kind of wanted to write a more realistic one. But yeah, I mean, I read all kinds of books growing up, classics. It's funny because before I was published, I didn't really pay attention to labels. Like, I didn't think of books as crime books or classics or literature, literary fiction. Those labels were sort of new to me. To me, a lot of crime books are classics. And as a kid, I read I remember reading Dostoevsky. Well, I was a little older than an old kid, but I loved kind of psychological crime novels, which I think really play into spy novels too, because a lot of it is the psychology of it. So I remember I read Crime and Punishment when I was younger, and then I actually remember reading Brothers Karamazov when I was doing my training at the farm. That's what we call the CIA's training center in Southern Virginia. It's called the Farm. And I remember thinking it was such an apt book to read while training to be a spy, because it's all about when do ends justify means and the psychology of crime, which I think is such a part of spy novels. So
that's awesome. The farm. See, when I say farm, I mean literally a farm. The guy picking potatoes around the corner from me.
Yeah, I can't go into details, but it is a pretty bucolic setting. So that's kind of where the name comes from. Awesome.
That's awesome. Stuart, what about you when you were doing your extensive training? What were you reading when you were learning how to shred guitar?
I started off with horror, really. I grew up in the 80s, so Stephen King. The Shining was the first adult novel I read at the age of 12, which is far too young, obviously, but didn't stop me. But my mum worked for the library service. So although we didn't have much money for buying books, there was always a steady supply because she worked at the sort of central depot where all the books were stored. So I could send her off with a list when she went to work in the morning. She'd come back with these books for me. And some of them were questions. Like, are you sure you should be reading The Howling? I remember being very embarrassed when she actually leafed through The Howling and found one of the sex scenes.
Right.
Which at the age of maybe 13, whatever it was, I was challenged about by my mother. But yeah, a lot of that kind of stuff. So there was I was lucky to have access to books, really as many as I wanted through that particular source. And then when I got older, I was I think I was into my 20s when I started reading crime fiction. Became the focus, and like Thomas Harris, thriller writers and so on, but also that school of American neo-noir. So James Ellroy and Dennis Lehane, Megan Abbott a bit later on. So yeah, it was kind of a strange mix of kind of the more fantastical end of things and the more gritty, realistic crime end of things, and you smush them together and you get me.
Well, what about you, Sean? What were you reading?
So I grew up in a pretty poor, small southern town, and so we couldn't afford books. But my mother, I don't know what you call them in the UK, but we would go to estate sales, yard sales, and so she would buy like 10 paperbacks for $1, and you never knew what you're gonna get. So you might get the biography of Peter the Great, or you might get a couple Lou Archer books by Ross McDonald. You might get a Chester Himes. You might get a Agatha Christie. So I read everything. And I grew up in a house full of readers. So my grandmother read romance novels voraciously. And so when I was 11 and 12, I was the grandkid who could read the best. So I would read the romance novels to my cousins. And, you get to words you don't understand. So then you got to go get the dictionary and like, oh, that's what tumescent means. Okay. And so I would read those things. and then like Stuart, my first a grown-up book was Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which my aunt gave to me. And I remember her telling me, she's like, hey, are you gonna be able to read this and not be scared? Because I don't want your mom to be angry at me if you get scared of this book. I was like, I'll be fine. It's not no big deal. And I finished that book. And then for the next 2 weeks, I slept with a popsicle stick crucifix under my pillow because I was afraid Ralphie Glick was going to come scratching at my window. And so I always was, I was surrounded by reading. My uncle introduced me to Philip Marlowe and the works of Raymond Chandler. And also he used to read a lot of Mickey Spillane, the Mike Hammer books. And they were the old gold key Mike Hammer covers. So they were very salacious covers. So my mother would make me cut the covers off the books before I could read them, which is, I guess, in theory was a nice idea, but it's all that sex in the pages, so the cover doesn't really matter. So I was like, I kept reading them. I was like, all right, I'll cut the covers off, whatever. And so I just was surrounded by reading all the time. I'll tell you one funny thing. My mother loved Greek and Roman and African mythology. So she read all the mythological folklore from multiple cultures, and she was big on riddles. So when we were little kids, if we wanted money for something, we had to solve a riddle. And I remember my brother turned 16, and he's like, I'm getting a job because I can't hack these riddles anymore. So
Brilliant. So I'm surprisingly you're not. From what you've said, each of you, you can see exactly the writers you are now from your early reading. You can see those influences. Alana, what about sort of the spy? You said you didn't read a lot of spy fiction. Have you since read a lot of spy fiction, and what do you like?
Yes, and I should say I did read spy fiction, but I never considered it spy fiction. Like I read Grant Green and Le Carré. I read C.J. Kosh, which not a lot of Americans know. He's Australian. The Year of Living Dangerously, which I thought was magnificent, like a literary masterpiece. And I never thought of those, and that's kind of spy adjacent, but I never thought of those as really spy novels. But I guess I did. I think they're just maybe more literary. Yeah. But yeah, since then I now read spy novels all the time, and there's so many I love, so many contemporary writers. Ian McEwan, The Innocent, that's one of my favorites. And recently I just read Alex Gurlis's Every Spy a Traitor, which just came out I think a couple days ago, which I loved. I was lucky enough to read an advanced copy of David McCluskey's next book, Seventh Floor. I think he's
was he Damascus Station? Was his? Yeah. That's really good.
Yes, he wrote Damascus Station. His second was Moscow X, and his third forthcoming is The Seventh Floor. So
was he a spy as well?
So he was an analyst at the CIA, right. And we just missed each other. I was there before he was. So I was a case officer, or they sometimes call them operations officers, which are the spies, the ones who go out and actually recruit human sources on the ground. I spent a year in Baghdad during the war, which was awful. But he's an analyst, so he's generally at headquarters, but would go out, TDY, temporary duty, to different locations and sort of provide the brains behind operations.
Right. He's one of the guys. He's got a big map in front of him with little figures of spies on it, and he pushes that around in big poles. And more spies over here, more spies there.
Exactly.
Does that? You're actually out, in the shit, as it were.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, he's like he has the institutional knowledge of countries and politics, and case officers aren't really known for their intellect. I'm just being honest. I mean, it's why, to be perfectly honest, there are quite a few CIA analysts turned writers. There aren't a lot of CIA case officers turned writers. They're not known as kind of the intellectual breed.
I would beg. Having read your book, I would beg to differ. It's amazing.
Thank you.
And a question for everybody here, since we're talking about spies, favorite spy writers? Go ahead, anybody. What do you like? Go ahead, Sean.
I read Alma Kalsu's Red Widow and Red London. I love those books. I love the sort of introspective, sort of, for lack of a better word, the nerdy aspect of spying. When I watch a movie, I love seeing like The Bourne Identity, the action-packed movies. But when I'm reading a book, I really love like the sort of deep, sort of introspective, sort of analytical spy books. And Alma Kalsu's Red series is amazing. I loved Red Widow. It's about an analyst who is trying to figure out who's a mole at a CIA facility. And then Red London is she's the same character. She's trying to recruit the wife of a Russian oligarch to become a human asset. And the day-to-day minutia of being a spy in that sort of setting, I love that kind of stuff. So, and of course I read Mick Herron's Slow Horses. I really enjoyed that. Old school, going back to the yard sale box, I had got a whole bunch of like old school Robert Ludlum stuff. So the Bourne Identity from Ludlum, but then the Chancellor manuscript and stuff like that, sort of old Cold War stuff. So all that kind of stuff is stuff that I really loved as a reader growing up. So
Robert Ludlum's titles were kind of hard to remember. They were all like the obelisk. It was all very weird. It was like two words.
There were a lot of like
geometry with each other,
put like
slammed together.
Geometry in there. It's like it was like the Saturday rhombus and stuff. So it was like,
yeah, it was like what? But they were good books.
Yeah,
good books. What about you, Mr. Neville?
Typical names, really. I mean, Mick, obviously, Mick Herron, who's a good friend of us both. Slow Horses books are just fantastic. And what I like about those is they have the same thing that I like about the Le Carre books and the Smiley books, is that I don't know how this kind of relates to the CIA work as well, but there's a kind of grim seediness, spycraft that Le Carre puts across. I think Mick Herron puts across as well, maybe with more humor. So I don't know if the American version of that has a bit more glamour to it, or if it is as kind of seedy as Le Carre presents it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think. Le Carre was sort of the first to really portray spying as not super glamorous and really gritty and dark, and the tough decisions you have to make. So that's what I love about Le Carre, and those are my favorite kind of spy novels. I have a question for you, Stuart, which is, this is one of my favorite spy novels, and I thought you might be, you're Irish, correct?
Yes.
Because he's Irish, and I feel like I bought this at a used book sale. This is terrific, this book, The Informer. Anyone know this book?
I've heard of it, but I've not read it.
I've heard of it. Was that in a film? Was that a
I think it was.
movie? Yeah.
I think it was. And I looked him up. He's a pretty apparently acclaimed author. And it's about it takes place during the 1920s Civil War in Ireland, which I know nothing about. But you don't have to know it, I think, to appreciate the book. It is so dark and gritty, and I mean, it's magnificent. So, just my plug for the.
I don't think I've read it. I think I've seen the movie.
Okay.
Which is good and well done. And there's a tragic ending to that story,
Yes.
as I remember.
I love tragic endings. Yes.
We like tragic endings. We're talking about spy stuff, and we'd be remiss not to mention Anthony Johnson, who's doing our technical stuff, whose graphic novel Atomic Blonde was out there, which was a great spy movie, and I thought Charlize Theron was brilliant in that. But in terms of spy, obviously, it's just talking about spy stuff. It shows you the breadth of this genre. Is there any other parts of there are little side corners of this genre which maybe people don't look at too much? What's the weirdest crime book you've read? Something that kind of is crime, but maybe there's dragons or spaceships in it or something. Is there anything that springs to mind? That's a really hard question to ask, but I thought I would throw it out there.
I read a novel a few years back. I'm not going to name the author. But it was a fairly straightforward kind of procedural cop thriller, but had a subplot involving a cat. It had its own entire story that involved it having this kind of connection back across millennia to its roots in Egypt and so on. And it mostly played out through the book of it wandering around its owner's apartment, looking out the window and seeing the city skyline, being reminded of the pyramids. And that I thought was odd. But then when I first went to BoucherCon for the first time, encountering cat mysteries.
Oh yeah, very, very popular.
That kind of thing, which I'm not by any means. I don't yuck other people's yums, I believe is the expression. If that's your thing, fair play to you. But that's kind of finding its way over the Atlantic now. And I know Anthony's been writing the Dog Walker.
Dog Sitter Mysteries, yeah.
Dog Sitter Mysteries and stuff. So that kind of cozy end of things is, I mean, obviously cozy's having a moment right now, but as odd as I thought that was, say, 15 years ago, at my first BoucherCon, it's now coming into the mainstream, that kind of pet-themed crime novel.
What about yourself? That thing, Sean?
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's a whole, there's the whole like Rita Mae Brown, the cat who blankety blank, and I know those are really successful. I think for me, the cat who did his taxes. But for me, I think the weirdest crime novel I ever read was there's two that stand out, and one of them I can't think of the name of it, but it was a guy about a guy who cleaned up crime scenes. And he got caught up in a crime story. I want to say it was Charlie Houston, but I'm not sure. And I can't think of the title of it. And I'm drawing a blank. But that was so weird because it was sort of just this person that's on the periphery of crime, And as crime writers, we don't usually worry about the aftermath of the murders and the mayhem that we create. And so that was really weird and interesting. The other one is a domestic, I hesitate to call it a domestic thriller. Oh my God. It's one of the craziest, darkest, disturbing novels I've ever read. It's called Tampa by Allison Nutting. And it's, I don't even want to describe it because we're in polite company, but it's a very weird, dark crime novel about a teacher in Florida in Tampa, who is she's a predator, a sexual predator. But the way it's written is from first person. And I read that book, and this is a compliment to the author. I had to take multiple baths after I read that book. It was so gross, but also so fascinating. And it was almost like somebody wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley from Ripley's point of view, and he had an enormous vocabulary to describe his sexual interest. It is not for the faint of heart. I don't recommend it to people that have delicate sensibilities. But it's a brave and really a lot of chutzpah in that book. But it is weird. It is very weird. Like, like I said, I read it and I went to church and took a bath and did Hail Marys. It's a dark, dark book.
What about you, Joanna? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, a book came to mind similar to Sean that was just unbelievably dark. The darkest book I'd ever read. It was called The Winter Girl. And also, like Sean's book, I couldn't even describe it. It would just kind of mortify me to describe it. It was so dark. I mean, it was like you think it can't get any darker, and then it gets darker. It's like every horrific thing. I mean, it has to do with like incest, and I mean, actually, that reminds me. Nabokov, I think, writes. He writes a lot of kind of twisted books, not just Lolita, which is one of my favorite books. I love Nabokov, but he wrote this book called Ada or Ardor, I think, about a relationship between brother and sister that was really twisted.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think whoever treated, I think Nabokov psychiatrists, whoever treated him made a lot of money, I think. And,
I know. I know.
They deserved every penny they got.
When I read Lolita, I was like, because there was so much controversy over the book and it was banned. And I was like, well, it's literature. Who cares? This guy, why does everyone think he's so weird? It's just a book. And then I read his other book and it was just like Lolita.
I think he's just a weirdo, to be honest.
Yeah.
He's dead. I don't care. He's kind of a weirdo. But I like when, things like there's Terry Hayes, who wrote I Am Pilgrim. His latest book takes a very unexpected turn. And, I know a lot of readers that weren't expecting it, and a lot of them were delighted about it, and a lot of them weren't. But I like when genres mix and slam together, which in a way kind of brings me, as I want to talk about your books a bit, so it brings me to Mr. Neville. Your new book's coming out in August in the UK.
Yeah.
And shortly after in the US, I think, Blood Like Mine. There it is there. I read this book last year. It was my favorite book of last year. Okay. And I don't want to tell anyone about it. I don't want to spoil anything. So, Stuart, tell us about this book.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because it's maybe one of those books, the less you know about it as you go in, the better, possibly. But it's the first book I've written under my own name that's set in the States. And it follows a mother and daughter, Rebecca Carter, and her daughter, who she calls Moonflower. And they're living a sort of itinerant lifestyle, traveling across the Western States, not speaking to anyone, living in a van, keeping undercover, moving from place to place. In parallel, there's an FBI agent called Mark Donner, who's investigating a series of killings where the bodies of men, all men with who are on the National Sex Offenders Registry for crimes against children, have been found with their throats opened, drained of blood, spinal cord severed, and bodies dumped in the wilderness. And Donner's been investigating this for a couple of years. And he finally gets a lead with a description of a woman who looks very like Rebecca. And catches up with her and her daughter and discovers that these killings, there might be more to them than a simple murder. They might be serving a deeper, darker need for Rebecca and her daughter. And I think that's about all I can say without giving too much away. It is very much a crossover novel. It's structured as a thriller, but you could read it as a horror very easily as well. So it does. I've always, from my first book, Ghost of Belfast, clues in the title. I've always kind of intermingled supernatural with the crime element to a greater or lesser extent. And over the last couple of books, I've dived more into that. I kind of returned to my roots to an extent with the horror end of things.
Yeah,
so
what if Stephen King wrote Silence of the Lambs? That was my take on it.
Yeah, it'd be a better book than mine if he did, but
you should. That's your book. That's awesome. Well, that's out. I love that. That's awesome. And Alana, tell us about The Peacock and the Sparrow. And you have a very personal connection with this book as well.
Yeah, so it's about an aging spy caught in the crosswinds of the Arab Spring, and he's on his last tour in Bahrain off the coast of Saudi Arabia, and he becomes embroiled in murder and consuming love and this unpredictable revolution. I've talked about it as a spy that I had to make these decisions. Like that had consequences where, for example, my informant helped to apprehend a top 10 alleged terrorist target. And then years later, we found out that he might not be guilty, that we might have gotten the wrong guy. And that has plagued me. It still plagues me. So, in a way, I think my book is my way of telling that story, because it's this guy who is forced to make decisions in this blur of good and bad, which in my book is the Arab Spring. I lived in Bahrain for 2 years, but after I left the CIA, but it was during the same period during the Arab Spring. But for me, that setting, the Arab Spring, was sort of the perfect prism to show kind of the murk of espionage that I had experienced. And yeah, so it was, in a way, I think it was a way of me processing what I had gone through. And I got back from Baghdad after a year. I had PTSD pretty clearly. At the time, we didn't really understand it, but it was just, it was a long process of me sorting through what my experience had meant. And I think part of the trauma was making these decisions in this fog of war and fog of espionage, and living with the consequences and living with the sort of unanswered questions. So that's the basis for my book. And that's, I'm sorry.
No, Gorka. Well, I was going to say it's great. It's a real, boiling pot, this book, straight away. And, it's sort of dripping in authenticity. You really feel as if you're there. You can smell the cigarette smoke and everything else. It's fantastic. So I loved it.
Thank you so much.
And Sean, you're All the Sinners Bleed, your latest. You think you can't, there's no hint about what's coming next?
Well, I'll talk about All the Sinners, and I'll tell what I'm working on now. So
awesome.
All the Sinners Bleed is the story of Titus Crown. He's the first Black sheriff in a small southern town in Virginia. He's a former FBI profiler who left the FBI under inauspicious circumstances, and he returned home to ostensibly take care of his aging father, and he decides to run for sheriff. And to the surprise of everybody, including himself, he wins. And so on the 1-year anniversary of his election, there's a shooting at the local high school. A teacher is killed by a former student, and then that student is killed by Titus's deputies. And in the ensuing investigation, Titus discovers that the teacher, the student, and a third mystery person, who eventually becomes known as the Last Wolf, were a trio of serial killers. And they were using the small town of Sharon as their dumping ground. I was inspired to write the book by the sort of the murder of George Floyd and how we deal with police corruption in America. But the book quickly morphed into sort of my own sort of cathartic essay about religion in the South and religion in America and religion in small towns, and how religion can be both some unifying principle, but also be a cudgel to beat people down. And there's a great Flannery O'Connor quote that talks about the South. Somebody asked her, was the South Christ-centered? And she said, I don't know about it being Christ-centered, but it's damn sure Christ-haunted. And it's haunted by the hypocrisy of Christianity. Perfect example of that. I live in a town of 8,000 people. There are 23 churches. And everybody has their own interpretation of what is the good word. And so the book was really interesting to write. I interviewed FBI agents. I interviewed the only two Black sheriffs in the history of Virginia, and neither one of them are that old. So that tells you a little bit about the society that we live in. And All Sinners Bleed, I didn't think people were gonna like it. Because I usually write about outlaws. I'm more familiar with outlaws. I have a few outlaws in my family, but I wanted to write. I wanted to write about a police officer because I had a conversation with Walter Mosley once, and he said, everybody has morality when it's easy, when they're not tested, and I wanted to write about a character who is trying to keep that order, trying to keep morality. And what happens when he's tested, when he's pressed, when he's pushed to his limit. A friend of mine, Ed Kurtz, who's a great horror and crime writer, said, writing a good book is throwing a character in a tree and then tossing rocks at him. And I think I tossed bricks at poor Titus. But it was influenced by a lot of things. Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, True Detective season 1 and 4. And so I'm really honored to be nominated for the Dagger. The people in the UK have really embraced the book. It's so dark. I'm so surprised. People love it. It's really dark.
It's a
It's my
great book.
darkest. Yeah. Well,
When
thank
people
you.
I love Titus. He's a
Oh
great
man.
character.
You know
I'd
what's
love
funny
to
about
see more of
Titus?
him.
Yeah, I wanted him to be a standalone because I write standalones, but I mean, I think I'm gonna kind of have to write another book because people are like they want to see him again. I have women that tell me he's their literary boyfriend, so they wish he was real. And so just to give you guys a hint of what I'm working on now, I'm currently working on a book called King of Ashes. It's about a family who own a crematory, a father and his three children. They're all adult children, oldest brother, middle sister, youngest baby brother. The beginning of the book, the oldest brother lives in Atlanta. He's a financial advisor. He's living this really, really hedonistic life, so to speak. He gets a call. He has to come home. The dad's in a coma. He's been in a car accident. When he gets home, he finds out that the car accident wasn't an accident, that his youngest baby brother owes money to some really dangerous criminals, and he finds himself trying to extricate his family from this debt, while at the same time the family has this trauma sort of hanging over them. When they were teenagers, their mother disappeared, and she's never been heard from again, and everybody in town thinks their father killed her because he owns a crematory and she was cheating on him. So this trauma has sort of affected how they deal with each other and their father, and the book is really about these roles that we get put in families, sometimes against our will. You know, you're the funny one, you're the smart one, you're the one we can depend on, and sort of how those roles are shaped by our experiences. And so I'm hard at work on it now. I have a deadline that's coming fast, hard, and in a hurry. So that's what we're working on now.
Sounds fabulous. Sounds fabulous. Folks, if you're watching and you have questions for us, put your question in the Q&A box. We have a couple there, and we're going to go to questions very shortly. That sounds great. Tell me, is there anything you've read recently that you've really enjoyed and happy to recommend?
Yeah, I'll go first. I read a book by a guy named John Ray, and I think he's from the UK, called Gone to the Wolves. And it's basically the story of three kids in the early American heavy metal scene in the 80s, and how that takes a really dark turn as they become adults. I thought it was just excellent. I thought it was really good. I'm a music fan of all genres, including heavy metal and hip hop and everything. And so it was really interesting to see that story play out as somebody who I was a little bit younger than when that movement was really taking hold, but I remember and I know a lot of those bands, and it was really interesting to see that. I really enjoyed that. Also, I read, I just finished it. This isn't a crime novel, but Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward. It's a historical novel. It takes place during the Civil War and in America. Jesmyn Ward is just amazing. To me, she's the heir apparent to Faulkner. She's incredible, and I just love her work. One last recommendation, and it's actually one that's is nominated for the nominated for the Dagger alongside me. But my friend Jordan Harper's book, Everybody Knows is a modern masterpiece. It's the unholy child of Chinatown and LA Confidential with a little bit of TMZ thrown in for good measure. And Jordan is probably, in my opinion, the finest crime writer working today. He's the most unique voice in crime fiction. And I just think it's a remarkable book. So if anybody hasn't read it, please check it out.
Awesome. What was the name of the heavy metal book?
Oh, Gone to the Wolves.
Gone to the Wolves. Just thinking that for Mr. Neville. Yeah, man, that's up your alley. Anyone else? Anything good you've read recently?
I read a book called Killing Jericho by William Hussey. He won an award at Capital Crime just a week or so ago. It's about an ex-cop who's from the traveling sort of fairground community in England. They're their own very specific community that travels site to site. I guess in America they call carnies. And it's kind of a nice blend of noir and a little bit of supernatural thrown in there. The book hints, but never quite 100% says that the protagonist Jericho might have a little bit of a second sight going on. He's haunted by these children, that were deliberately killed in a house fire that he was investigating their case when he was a cop, and basically lost it and attacked the perpetrator and was drummed out of the police for that. So that's kind of in the noir, a little bit of supernatural end of things. I also read recently and enjoyed for panel completely opposite end of crime, just a show at a broad church. This is How to Solve Your Own Murder by Kristen Perrin, very much in the cozy end of things. I think it's been quite successful in the States, no long out here in the UK. So if you like something a bit more gentle, whimsical, I think that might be one for you.
Excellent. And Alana, you've mentioned a few already.
Yeah, no, I recently read a book called The Attack, which I think was made into a movie by Yasmina Khadra, I think is the name. It's a pseudonym. It's a man who wrote it, but it's a female name. And it was terrific. It's basically this an Arab doctor who's been assimilated into Israel, who is quite successful. I mean, it really speaks to the current conflict, what's going on. And his wife is a suicide bomber, and he has to sort of come to terms with that. And the whole book is him discovering what led her to do that. So it's just a kind of a psychological exploration that I thought was terrific. It just beautifully written. Yeah.
The breadth of books recommended here. I'm going to ask Mr. Johnson, if he's listening, to come back in because we have some listener questions here. There he is, the man himself. Hi, Anthony.
Yeah, I've been watching the whole time. I'm always here.
I thought you were going to watch the election debate. There's a debate apparently at the moment.
No. I'm always here lurking somewhere. Yes, we have a few questions from the audience. We're going to start with one from Alex Hawley, old friend of some of us. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Alex.
Great question, actually. He says, this is a truly global panel today. True. He says, is there anywhere that the panel has researched but not yet written about?
Ooh. Go ahead.
So I was very lucky enough to go to Norway in February. I was in Oslo. The book got released in Oslo, Ulcers Bleed. And I really loved the city and the country. And so I've done research about, I have a possible idea about maybe my own sort of, amateur spy novel that I'd love to sit in Oslo. I'm a big fan of those 1940s, 50s Graham Greene novels, and so I haven't written about it yet, but I took a lot of notes when I was in Norway. And, as crime writers, when we go places, I don't know if you guys do this, but, I look at things, like, is that a good place to dump a body? Or how would I get out of this? How would I get out of this bar if a fight started? And, could I rob the National Art Gallery if I had to? So I took a lot of notes. So we may see something with that down the road.
I do have occasionally those thoughts. Yeah, I don't think there's anywhere that have gone specifically to research that I haven't written about yet. But all life is research for us. Anyone else have researched something? No?
I spend a huge amount of time on Google Maps.
Yeah.
Google Street View. And because I'm writing the sequel to Blood Like Mine at the minute. There's parts of it set in Tucson, Arizona. I've spent a good bit of time in Arizona, but mostly around Scottsdale and Flagstaff, and then more sort of Phoenix Metro up to northern Arizona. So I've never been to Tucson, so I've been spending a lot of time with Google Maps and finding alleyways and different buildings and around the airport and this kind of stuff. So I find it a very helpful tool. But that reminds me of, I can tell a story. Years ago, I think I was writing my second novel, Collusion, and I was setting. One of my characters was living in an apartment at the corner of Hester and Ludlow in New York, in Chinatown in New York. And I needed him to be able to escape through an alleyway at the back of the building. But there's no alleyway at the back of the building. And I was I'd gone to actually physically gone there in New York, and then I'd spent all this time on Google Street View trying to find, is there somewhere? There's no alleyway. I need an alleyway. And I remember putting out on Twitter, as it was at the time, just saying this, I'm having this problem. I need an alleyway. There's no alleyway. And somebody came back with the most helpful answer. Make it up. So it's that kind of stuck with me ever since. When in doubt, make it up, because I think we can be sometimes a little bit too beholden to reality. And if you needed to be a street there, just put a street there.
Yeah.
If you need to be a building or a tree in a particular spot, it's unlikely.
I think if you do that, you have to be prepared. You will get one email from somebody saying, "Yeah, Mr. Neville, my enjoyment of your otherwise excellent novel was spoiled because there's no alleyway." But sure,
Absolutely. Actually, that reminds me, Stuart, I just want to emphasize, by the way, that the dogs in my Dog City Detective books, they are not magical. They are not the investigators. They are real dogs that behave in real ways. They're not like the cats that solve mysteries.
he writes proper dog books.
Proper dog books, yeah. Along the same lines, actually, and this is still with the global theme, Alistair Rutherford asks, which writers from or writing about Africa, Asia, and or South America would any of you recommend?
I love, they're not crime writers, but I love Gabriel Garcia Marquez, just one of the great writers of our time. I was a kid, I was really weird, and I read a lot of Jose Luis Borgia when I was a kid. The Man with Enormous Wings is one of my favorite stories. So those writers are great. From Asia, there's a crime writer who I don't know how many people in the United States know him, but I think people in the UK know him. Ego Amo Rampo, the Japanese locked room mystery writer. He took his name as an anagram or a phonetic anagram of Edgar Allan Poe. He writes what he did. I think he's passed away now, but incredible locked room mysteries. And he was one of the founders of the Japanese sort of mystery movement. So he's a great writer. This isn't from Asia or from Africa. Oh gosh, it's never mind. I've lost it. But there's a lot of writers that are from international locales that, as an American, I realized pretty early on that I don't. That's a blind spot in my reading history. So I really have sort of tried, especially in the last few years, to read more writers outside of the English-speaking world. It's hard sometimes to get translations in America, and so that makes it a little more difficult.
Anyone else?
I mean, the book. I'm sorry.
No, go on. You probably got better answer than me.
Similar to Sean, I mean, most of the books, I haven't read a lot of authors from those areas, but I've read books from the expat perspective in those areas. Some of the ones I mentioned, C.J. Koch, Year of Living Dangerously was written about Indonesia. Graham Greene wrote about Vietnam. I loved George Orwell, Burmese Days, which I think are all very kind of critical of, critical of sort of the Western perspective, which I think is valuable.
I'm coming up embarrassingly short on that question, not to be honest. I've read plenty of stories set in Asia, South America, and Africa, but not necessarily by authors from those regions, which is a failing of mine, to be honest. But slightly tangentially, a good friend of mine, Henry Chang, he's a label mate of mine at Soho Press. He writes about the Chinese diaspora, and primarily in Chinatown, New York, but wider afield as well. And he has that. He helped me a lot, actually. I wrote a book a few years ago called Here and Gone, which had a prominent Asian American character, and he helped me a lot with that character and rooting that character in Chinatown in San Francisco. And he helped me a great deal in just kind of grounding that and how sort of people of different generations speak to each other. And all the stuff, obviously, I wouldn't know as an outsider. So I can thoroughly recommend Henry Chang if you want to know about Chinese American, Asian American life, and particularly that sort of urban Chinatown, New York, quite insular community that he writes about really, really well.
Brilliant. I just quickly recommend there's two British Asian crime writers that set their books in historical mysteries, and that would be Abir Mukherjee's Wyndham and Banerjee series, which is fantastic, and Vasim Khan has a couple of historical series. There is the Bibi Ganesh, novels, which are amazing. The Inspector Chopra novels. This police inspector who inherits a baby elephant and has amazing adventures, and the Malabar House series, which Vaseem writes. Both of them have their latest books are not historical. So Abier's is Hunted, which is a great political thriller, bang up to date. And I'm reading at the moment Basim's new book, which is set in the States. It's called The Girl in Cell A, and it's really good. I'm really enjoying it. So there's two from me.
Also, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who I think wrote really well about kind of the dichotomous East-West perspectives of Asia, Vietnam.
We have a question here from Thomas, specifically for Ilana. He asks, when writing your book, was it difficult for you? Because he assumes you were drawing on some very personal experiences. And how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more cathartic than anything else. I had written a memoir earlier, years ago, and that I felt was too personal for me. And that was actually more difficult to kind of write directly about myself, and because I'm kind of a private person, and to the idea of putting it out in the world, but kind of funneling it into fiction and a character who on the surface is really not like me and has the freedom to make decisions and explore things that I couldn't, was more freeing to me, and so cathartic, I'd say.
Actually, that's worth asking, I think, for the rest of you as well, including you, Steve. How much do you draw on real life experiences? Not that you're all crazed serial killers, or maybe you are, I don't know. But how much do you draw on, your own real life experiences and emotional experiences?
Where All Sinners Bleed, there are several scenes where Titus is talking about his mother that are taken from my own personal life. My mother was very ill for most of my life. She had physical disabilities. And so, there's a line I wrote that in the book where Titus thinks that there's a pain that only a son knows whose mother can't hug him. And that's a very sort of personal moment for me in my life. But also, I think you don't have to do that. I don't think you have to draw autobiographically. Like, I had a lady ask me, when did I learn how to steal cars? I don't know how to steal cars from Blacktop Wasteland. And
you don't know how to steal cars? What kind of a crime writer are you?
I know, what kind of Southerner am I that I don't know how to steal a car? But I think you draw enough autobiographical stuff to sort of sprinkle it into the story. But the majority of stuff, the fun part is making stuff up.
Yeah.
Stuart, what about you?
I think it tends to creep in subconsciously.
Yeah.
More than anything, it'll shape characters, maybe in ways you didn't intend, but after the fact, you look back and oh, hang on, have I got a bit too close there? Like my new book, Dissenter, with a 12-year-old girl. I just so happen to have a 12-year-old daughter. That might be a coincidence. I don't know. I somehow doubt it. But and it's certainly not a coincidence that as soon as I had kids, parenthood became a big theme in all of my books. It started off about these kind of lone wolf men kind of battling through life on their own. And all of a sudden, I'm married, I have kids. They're books about parents and kids, and it all kind of comes out. And I think we're all magpies. I think all writers are magpies to some extent or another. We all sort of lift little things. I remember I was hanging out with a band, one of the crime writers, and telling an anecdote. And I can't even remember what it was, but just when I finished it, my friend Mark Billingham, the great writer, tapped me on the shoulder and he goes, "Just so you know, I'm having that." And
typical Billingham.
Sorry.
No, I was just saying typical Billingham.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, but just little things, just little shiny objects you see around you, little things that happen. You're constantly, I think, storing them away, and they will eventually come out in your stories.
Absolutely, you're right. bits bleed in, whether you're aware of it or not. You know, it all kind of comes out. I think we have a hard out at 8 o'clock. We might have time very quickly for one more, Anthony. What do you think?
Well, actually, I was going to say this is the last question, and I think this is appropriate because this is for you, Steve, rather than the panel. Time for you to answer a question from Bonnie Kistler in the audience. She says, "Kill for Me, Kill for You is my favorite thriller so far this year. I went in expecting strangers on the train, but you took it to another level. Could you talk about how you came up with that metamorphosis?"
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed, Bonnie. It's very kind of you. I'm not related to Bonnie, by the way, just make that clear. Yeah, I changed it. Basically, I took the bones of it. The idea of swapping murders, two strangers swapping murders. So instead of two men, as in Strangers on the Train, it's two women. And that changes the perspective completely. And it's also about, I wanted you to be willing and with these women and want them to succeed in swapping murders. Whereas in the Highsmith book, these people are doing it for bad reasons and you're not really with them and they're all bad people. I wanted you to be rooting for these people to execute their murders. And book was hell to write. And I had a lot of help, mostly from Mrs. Cavanagh, who's watching. So it was a team effort.
Fair enough. All right, well then, let's draw it to a close. I'll say thank you to Steve, and remind everybody in the audience that if you haven't, obviously you should check out the panel's books. You should also check out Steve's books, because we don't call him the master of the
Yes, there's a new one coming as well. Hello.
I will remind everybody that there are many, many more events for National Crime Reading Month listed at crimereading.com. So please do go and check that out. Thank you to Ilana, Sean, and Stuart for their time. Thanks to Steve for running the panel. And thank you all for watching. Have a great evening and goodbye.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.